There's a lot that goes into writing an anime, or, well, any piece of narrative media, really. You might think it's as simple as naming and designing a few characters, giving them a goal, and then writing down the steps they take to reach that goal in as interesting language as you can muster. And it is, but it's also not. Like, not at all. Stories don't just exist to exist. They exist to fulfill needs in their audience and in their creators, and writing is, in a way, the art of balancing those different needs. Needs that can sometimes work against each other. Maybe a heartfelt confession needs to come in the middle of Act 3 for maximum emotional impact, but it makes way more logical sense for your characters to get their romantic tension out of the way before the final battle even starts. A good writer needs to strike a balance between making their story emotionally resonant and making sure that the characters don't act like total fucking idiots for the sake of better drama. To be very reductive, we want stories to be meaningful and emotionally fulfilling in ways that real life rarely is, without being reminded that these stories aren't real, or even worse, that they couldn't possibly be real because they just don't make any goddamn sense. This balancing act is already tricky enough to pull off when you're writing a story set in the real world that your audience is familiar with, but it gets exponentially more difficult when you shift the setting somewhere more fantastical or futuristic. Because now you're not just forced to conform to the existing logic of our universe, you need to invent new rules that make your universe stand apart from it, and then make sure that those rules are internally consistent, all while still working to make your characters act like real people and keep up a satisfying pace. Now, true, there are some segments of the audience for fantasy and sci-fi anime who just straight up don't care and will even vehemently defend plot points that don't make any sense because it's not supposed to be realistic, but I think for most of us, it's important that we be able to buy into the fictional worlds being presented in the media we consume. That's why world building, the art of crafting the histories, systems, geographical details, and cultures that make these places feel real, is so damn important. Now, given the time, I think that just about anyone can dream up a detailed fantasy or sci-fi world. Maybe not a cohesive one, that takes a strong grasp of cause and effect, but at the very least, most writers can come up with a nifty premise for a world and build a society around that, with a detailed enough history to be believable. Even if you don't have a particularly strong imagination, the history of the real world is full of great source material that can be built upon if you're willing to put in the research. But none of that is worth a damn if you can't present it to the audience in a manner that's both engaging and believable. The real artistry in world building lies not in actually compiling the details, but in finding an organic way to convey them without breaking the integrity of your world or story in the process. I mean, you can just start your story with a 3-page or 10-minute prologue explaining how the world works, but that's gonna be a slog to get through, and you can't just pass it off into the story. Characters who live in a fantasy world aren't just gonna start explaining it for no reason. I mean, do you ever take the time to explain to your friends the intricacies of high-rise living, or how the internal combustion engine changed the world in casual conversation? Of course you don't. Those are natural parts of our world that don't need explaining or even thinking about, really. And the same goes for fantasy or science fiction elements. They should be as natural to the characters who live with them as microwaves and the internet are for us. If they're not, if the characters feel a need to explain everything for no reason, do you want Black Clover? Because that's how you get Black Clover. This is, in part, why the isekai model for fantasy stories, where a hero is transported to another world from our own, is so popular. Dropping a character who knows nothing about your world into the thick of it creates a perfect excuse to have them ask what would otherwise be basic, obvious questions. That's also the appeal of the amnesiac protagonist we see so dang often, especially in JRPGs. Now, used poorly, these characters merely serve to move the info dump from a text crawl at the start of the story into dialogue a few minutes in. Used well, though, they can turn the discovery of the world into an interesting plotline in its own right. Overlord is one of the best isekai stories in recent memory, and its approach to world building is a big factor in its success. Overlord's titular protagonist, Momonga, is transported from his favorite VR MMO to a fantasy world with the same rules as the game, but a vastly different geography and culture. Momonga enters this new world powerful, absurdly so, but he doesn't know the first thing about it, so he needs to learn, and learn a lot, if he's going to fulfill his goal of taking over the whole thing. That involves sending out spies to all corners of the globe, as well as pretending to be an adventurer in order to do exploratory missions of his own. What I love about this approach is that it means that the act of world building in itself is a source of intrigue and tension. We're not just finding out how the world works because we as an audience need to know it for the story to work. Each new faction and important person we discover is a potential wrinkle in the Overlord's plan, which means that simply learning this information changes the direction of the plot. The believability of this world is further helped by the series' staggeringly huge cast of characters, each with their own motivations, affiliations, and relationships. We get to know not just the Guardians of Nazarick, which, man, there are a lot of those, but the members of several other key factions as well. I really enjoyed learning about the Lizardmen at the start of Season 2. I talked at length about how good character writing is important to world building in this video about Falcom's Kiseki series though, so click here if you want to learn more about that. Through the eyes of Momonga, aka Ainz Ul Gon, and his agents, we get to slowly piece together details about the show's world. Both broad stroke stuff like societal structures, religious influences, and political divisions, as well as nitty-gritty details about individual villages. And both elements are important. Those big ideas are necessary to create the impression of a real functioning society, or several real functioning societies, as the case may be. Overlord's world is a land of warring nation-states and competing ideologies, not unlike our own. And on top of making the world seem more rich as a whole, these varied nations each have a history that connects to the game Momonga came from, Yggdrasil Online, meaning that each new one we discover has added significance. But I'd argue that the extreme detail in which we see places like Karn Village, Eirantel, and the Great Lake of the Lizardmen rendered is even more vital to creating a believable world. It's all well and good when a writer can birth new religions or political alliances from their own imagination, but it doesn't amount to much when the world doesn't hold up to closer scrutiny. Kugane Murayama didn't have to write detailed population statistics for every last village and town in his world, but the amount of detail he does give us on the places that we do get to explore in depth creates an impression that there's more to the places we haven't seen yet. And he likely has many fully formed ideas about this world that the story hasn't even touched on yet. When you're building a world for a story, if you do your job right, you're going to create more than you have room to fit in. And that's a good thing. We know that there's more to the real world than what we experience ourselves, and good world building creates the same impression of a fictional place. What the author doesn't tell us is often as important as what he does, because that can tell us about the character's place in the world. And I can think of very few better examples of this principle in action than another show from this season, Darling in the Franxx. 8 episodes in, we've been explicitly told very little about how the world of Franxx works, what its history is, and even what kind of people inhabit it. We see the world entirely through the eyes of a group of teenagers who spend almost every minute that they aren't fighting giant monsters cooped up inside an elaborate glass birdcage. And we don't even know as much as they know, because it would be really weird for them to just sit around the table explaining details about their world to each other or the adults in charge of them. We do know that humanity lives in big dome cities called plantations and is under siege from giant magma-eating monsters called klaxosaurs. We know that they can only be defeated by giant sex robots piloted by teenagers whose sole purpose is piloting those robots and who feel they'd be better off dead if they can't do so. We know that those robots were invented by an old guy with cyborg parts on his face, and that he also created a half klaxosaur girl to serve as an experimental pilot. And we know that the squad of teenagers we're following is also part of an experiment, but that's really it. We barely have any idea why the world is this way in the first place, why the government is running these experiments, or even why the robots need teenage pilots in the first place. Seeing the vast wasteland in episode 1, we're led to believe that the world is a result of some sort of apocalyptic event, but that's only confirmed when they find the ruins of an old city in episode 7. Information in this show comes at a very slow drip. Literally, the only exposition that we get about the unique features of this world focuses on a peculiar species of bird, and we only learn about that because it holds metaphorical significance for Hero and Zero 2. Thus far, it's had no actual impact on the plot, and I wouldn't expect it to. In spite of this, we can infer a lot about this world. In episode 1, for instance, we see that the kids becoming parasites is a really big deal, big enough for the adults to pack a whole stadium just to watch it. Yet a glitch reveals that the leaders of this society can't actually be bothered to come out for the event, instead choosing to appear as holograms. This implies that they're either cowards or that they're seen as too important to face any risk. We later learn that the leader of these masked figures is called Papa by the kids, and that he's directly in charge of their operations as Franxx pilots as well as their day-to-day lives. But he's not just some ordinary military leader. The kids say prayers in his name at every meal and seem to view his every decision as absolute. He controls the society not just through military might or standard leadership, but through the administration of a religion that holds him up as a god or prophet figure, a status that's reflected in his ostentatious pope-like garb. In later episodes, we learn that Papa is the one who originally brought humanity to live in the plantations instead of on the surface, so we have some idea where that reverence comes from. Unsurprisingly, since we spend so much time with them, we also learn a lot about the kids, and especially how this society views and uses them. It's shown repeatedly that they're seen as disposable. They only have names because Hiro decided to nickname them in the first place. Before she meets him, 02 chews through partners, and the adults don't bat an eye about how many kids she's killing. Hiro himself feels like he'd be better off dead if he can't pilot a Franxx. The big reveal in episode 8 is that the previous members of Squad 13 died, seemingly right before the kids came to train at the plantation, and that instead of cleaning up after them, the adults just boarded up their old rooms. The kids in this world clearly have a very low survival rate, and it seems very likely that they never actually get a chance to become adults at all, either due to fighting the Klaxosaurs or something more sinister than that. But moreover, it's heavily implied that their primary value lies in their sexual functions, and not just because they pilot waifu robots by doing the nasty. The kids are told absolutely nothing about romance and sex. They don't even know what kissing is, yet when they reach the onset of puberty in episode 8, the adults watching them take a very vested interest in seeing how they develop. And then there's the matter of their uniforms, which are drab and gray aside from one standout feature, their big red ties, which have two very distinctive shapes: X's on the girls' uniforms and Y's for the boys. They're literally marked by their chromosomes. The adults in 02, meanwhile, have more normal, neutrally shaped ties, implying that they have some value to society and an identity beyond what's between their legs. Obviously, the boys and girls of Squad 13 have very strong and defined personalities, but as we see when we meet Squad 26, they seem to be the only ones. Other parasites are shown to be homogenized and stripped of their individuality so that they can function better as a unit. Noticing this, in turn, allows us to infer a bit about the nature of the Squad 13 experiment, and okay, look, I can spend a long time digging my way down this rabbit hole, but I think I've more than made my point. Darling in the Franxx takes a very realistic approach to world building. The characters say very little about their world because it wouldn't make sense for them to exposit. Yet the detail is still all there. It informs character and set designs, the staging of scenes, and subtle nuances in dialogue. Even if a writer doesn't plan to lay them all out for the audience, thinking through these details makes a world feel more cohesive and realistic. And if they're not there behind the scenes, if the team is just making things up as they go along, we can tell. World building isn't the be-all and end-all of good writing. No one thing is, and you can totally wing it with your world building and still write a great story. Looking at you, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But it is important. It often makes the difference between fun anime that we just watch to be entertained and anime that we wish we could live in. This season's given us plenty of good examples of the latter beyond the two that I've covered here, and looking back at classic anime, we're absolutely spoiled for choice, so this is a topic that I may return to in the future if you guys are interested. Now, as for this video, I want to thank Funimation for sponsoring it and helping me make it happen. They're simuldubbing both Darling in the Franxx and Overlord over on their streaming platform Funimation Now, which means they have fully dubbed episodes coming out just 3 weeks after they air in Japan. That's a service they're also providing for Pop Team Epic, Takagi-san, Hakata Tonkotsu Ramen's Death March, Citrus, Ancient Magus Bride, and Card Captor Sakura, among other shows. If you prefer to watch anime in English, and hey, don't be ashamed of it, a lot of us do, Funimation Now lets you watch new episodes dubbed in 5.1 surround sound sooner than you can anywhere else. They're also simuldubbing Dragon Ball Super, which I literally can't watch in any language other than English, and Black Clover, which is substantially improved by the absence of... Yeah, that. You can follow the link in the doobly-doo to check out their streaming service, as well as their store, where you can buy hundreds of Blu-rays of your favorite anime. They just announced the dubcast for Re:Zero, another show with strong world building, so hopefully you'll be able to buy that there soon as well. On top of Funimation, I of course have to thank my patrons for their support in making these videos. I wouldn't be able to make stuff like this without them. In particular, I want to thank my top patrons, Bob Harris, Jisoo Seo, Blocked Writer, Queeper, Ali Al Solial, Divide by Zero, Lee Watts, Blue Butterfly F, Light Rapid, Bing Theo, Eric Weber, Tenlade, Tate Fancher, and Jacob Piatik for being the absolute best. Thank you guys for being awesome. I'm Geoff Thew, professional shitbag, signing out from my mother's basement.